2 Death Stars, both destroyed. The most expensive singular construction projects in galactic history, each costing 1 trillion galactic credits, demolished in the same war by the same rebellion, before either one fired its primary weapon in actual combat more than once. Then the Executor, 19,000 meters of reinforced hull, 280,000 crew, 325 billion credits, killed at the Battle of Endor when a single damaged rebel A-wing crashed through its unshielded bridge. One uncontrolled fighter on a terminal trajectory found the exposed command deck, and the most powerful warship the Galactic Empire ever commissioned fell into the Death Star it was supposed to be protecting. The Empire had a theory of victory. Palpatine built that theory out of terror and concentrated firepower, and built it over the documented objections of the one Imperial commander whose strategic analysis was correct. Grand Admiral Thrawn argued, during his own promotion ceremony to Grand Admiral, that the Death Star program was consuming resources that could have funded thousands of maneuverable capital ships, ships that couldn't be destroyed by one torpedo, one design oversight, or one A-wing with nowhere else to be. Palpatine dismissed him. The Death Stars were built. They were destroyed. The math is the argument, and it doesn't require interpretation to land. 1 Death Star, 1 trillion galactic credits, confirmed across both Legends and Disney continuity. 1 Imperial-class Star Destroyer, 150 million credits, also confirmed. Divide those numbers, and you get 6,666 Star Destroyers per Death Star. 2 Death Stars means roughly 13,300 ISDs at face value. Add the Executor's 325 billion credits, and you're at the construction equivalent of approximately 15,500 Star Destroyers. A fleet so large, the Rebel Alliance stops being a military problem and starts being a scheduling inconvenience. The 10,000 in this video's title represents roughly 1 Death Star's equivalent spending, adjusted conservatively for operational costs. The actual superweapon program across both stations plus the Executor was considerably more expensive than that. The round number is, if anything, a gift to the Emperor. Thrawn told him. He was right. Here is the evidence. Before any of this, before the superweapon program consumed the Imperial budget and started producing the most expensive debris fields in galactic history, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer was already doing exactly what Palpatine needed done. At 1,600 meters long, carrying 37,000 crew, 72 TIE fighters, and ground assault capacity sufficient to subdue and occupy a planetary capital, an ISD sitting in your system's orbital lane wasn't an invitation to negotiate. It was the entire argument made physical and present. The design concentrates everything forward. All primary weapons directed at the threat, engineering and drive systems in the protected rear, producing what remains the most aggressively recognizable silhouette in naval architecture. The distinctive Star Destroyer profile became the visual shorthand for Imperial authority across billions of inhabited star systems. The Empire didn't deploy ISDs because they were visually dramatic. It deployed them because a Star Destroyer in your orbit changed the local cost-benefit analysis of resistance before a single weapon was fired. That is what the fleet does. It shows up everywhere, simultaneously, indefinitely. It denies staging areas. It occupies transit routes. It sits in orbit above your capital city and makes resistance a logistical problem rather than an ideological one. Imperial-class Star Destroyers were, in purely conventional military terms, exactly the right instrument for maintaining control across a dispersed, multi-system empire. Distributed, individually replaceable, simultaneously present across dozens of systems. Lose one to an engagement, and the fleet continues its operational mission. The other 6,665 are still in their systems, still in their orbits, still making the argument. The Executor class is something else entirely, and understanding what it is requires holding its scale as a physical reality rather than a statistic. 19 kilometers. The Empire State Building stands 443 meters. 42 of them placed end-to-end still fall short of the Executor's hull length. Its command tower stood taller than most orbital stations the Empire used as forward operating bases. Its hangar bays housed more starfighters than the combined air defenses of several mid-tier planetary systems, with room for additional craft. Its crew of 280,000, nearly a third of 1,000,000 people living and working inside the hull simultaneously, meant the Executor carried a deployed population larger than most medium-sized cities the Empire governed. When the Executor appeared in frame alongside a standard Imperial-class Star Destroyer in The Empire Strikes Back, the regular ISD looked like it belonged to a different category of object entirely. It did. The visual hierarchy was deliberate. The Executor wasn't a large Star Destroyer. It was a different class of physical presence, something that redefined the scale reference of every other object near it. Ship design documentation describes the Executor class as deliberately dagger-shaped, distinct from the more symmetric triangular profile of the Imperial class, with the hull tapering forward to a pronounced point and the superstructure ridge running centrally down the full length. The design intent was unambiguous menace from every approach angle. The Executor was built to be seen as much as it was built to fight, which is exactly the Tarkin Doctrine's logic applied at the level of individual hull design. The ship's presence was supposed to do strategic work before its weapons ever fired. Watching The Empire Strikes Back without foreknowledge of the ship's scale, as most people first encountered it, there is a section of the Executor's mid-deck hull that registers, in the film's framing, as something resembling an urban skyline. The communications towers, sensor clusters, defensive turret emplacements, and superstructure arrays on the Executor's upper hull are each, individually, at building scale. A single communications relay on that hull is physically larger than most real-world structures most viewers have ever entered. The ship is large enough that its functional infrastructure produces the visual grammar of a city. Vertical elements, grid organization, structures with apparent interior volume at building dimensions, when framed against the void of space. The ship's scale is genuine, the infrastructure is genuinely there, and the impression it creates tells you something real about what 19,000 meters of warship actually means as a physical object. The Executor cost 325 billion credits. It was destroyed at the Battle of Endor by a single damaged A-wing crashing through one bridge window. Grand Admiral Thrawn was the only non-human to hold the rank of Grand Admiral in the Imperial Navy. That detail isn't incidental color. The Empire was institutionally, explicitly, and without apology speciesist. Humans commanded capital ships, humans held senior operational ranks, non-humans crewed them in secondary roles or were governed as subjects. For Palpatine, who constructed human supremacy as deliberate political architecture, to personally elevate a CIS officer to the Navy's highest operational rank, Thrawn had to be performing so far above the available human alternatives that the Emperor's own structural ideology bent around the exception. Palpatine didn't make ideological exceptions for sentiment. His promotion to Grand Admiral took place in a direct meeting with the Emperor. In Disney canon, this ceremony is the setting where Thrawn's disagreement with the Death Star program reaches its sharpest documented expression. The substance of his argument was an operational problem stated in operational terms. The superweapon program was weakening Imperial fleet presence across key systems at precisely the moment when distributed, permanent, physically present capital ship deployment was most strategically valuable. Every credit going to the Death Star was a credit not building a Star Destroyer that could sit in a system's orbital lane indefinitely, maintaining visible Imperial authority without the garrison resentment that occupied planetary surfaces reliably generate over time. His alternative? Mobile strike groups, advanced starfighters, fortified planetary positions. The Imperial military as a distributed network of simultaneous presence, rather than a concentrated spike of force pointed at one threat at a time. Palpatine's counter was built entirely on deterrence. When the Death Star is operational, its mere existence ends all resistance. No system will rebel against a weapon that can destroy planets. The Emperor's position wasn't that conventional fleet assets were worthless. It was that fear, applied at sufficient scale, made their constant deployment unnecessary. One planet destroyed publicly would do the work that 10,000 ships in 10,000 systems would otherwise have to do continuously. Thrawn's response, in the structure of his documented military philosophy and his specific actions in Rebels, amounted to a rejection of that logic on practical grounds. Deterrence requires credibility. Credibility requires demonstrated willingness. Demonstrated willingness against civilian planets produces radicalization rather than compliance. And the weapon that performs the demonstration also represents a 1 trillion credit single point of failure that can't be at 2 systems simultaneously and can be destroyed by 1 torpedo if anyone finds the right exhaust port. In Star Wars Rebels, confirmed Disney canon, the TIE Defender program is where this conflict produces its most specific, documentable consequence. The TIE Defender was Thrawn's proposed solution to a clearly visible operational weakness. The standard TIE/LN fighter had no shields and no hyperdrive. It was cheap, numerically overwhelming, and lethal in large formations against unshielded targets. Against shielded Rebel X-Wings with trained pilots, it died in disproportionate numbers. The kill ratios weren't strategically sustainable, and Thrawn knew it. Consuming pilots faster than the Empire could train them, while an opponent rebuilt its fighter strength from a dispersed network of hidden bases, was a slow attrition the Empire was losing. The TIE Defender addressed the specific problem with specificity. Shields, hyperdrive, sufficient firepower to engage X-Wings competitively, rather than relying on 3-to-1 numerical superiority that bled the pilot corps. It was practical, comparatively affordable, and directly targeted a documented battlefield failure the Empire was actively suffering. Director Krennic's Death Star project took its funding. Tarkin told Thrawn directly. The TIE Defender program was at risk because the Death Star had secured the budget it needed. A practical instrument for improving Imperial starfighter survivability, specifically designed to address a documented fleet weakness Thrawn had identified, was cancelled to fund a 1 trillion credit space station with a thermal exhaust port. This sequence of events is confirmed Disney canon, not inference. The 10,000 figure in the title deserves one honest note. No primary source records Thrawn speaking that specific number. What exists in verified canon is his documented opposition to the Death Star program, his consistent advocacy for conventional fleet resources over superweapon investment, and the TIE Defender episode as the concrete policy consequence of the Death Star winning the budget argument. The arithmetic that produces the number is real. 1 trillion credits at 150 million per ISD yields 6,666 Star Destroyers per Death Star. And some fan calculations incorporating crew costs and fighter complements push the equivalent considerably higher. The argument is Thrawn's. The math is straightforward. The title reflects what the numbers say, with the specific phrasing representing the community's formulation of Thrawn's documented strategic position, rather than a direct verbatim quote. What made Thrawn's approach distinct from standard Imperial military doctrine wasn't disagreement about firepower. It was an understanding that military power requires deployability to function, and that deployability requires distribution. A fleet of thousands of Star Destroyers occupies thousands of systems simultaneously, denies the rebellion staging areas and recruitment zones, and presents no single point of catastrophic failure. A Death Star can be in one system on one day against one target, and if that target happens to contain one pilot with exceptional instincts and a working torpedo, the entire 1 trillion credit investment ends in a chain reaction. The rebellion's operational survival depended entirely on the Empire being unable to be everywhere at once, on finding the gaps in Imperial presence and operating through them. Fleet mass closes those gaps permanently. The Death Star leaves them open in every system it isn't currently occupying, which is always every system except one. Thrawn explained this. The TIE Defender got cancelled. The Death Stars got built. The Tarkin Doctrine needs to be understood fully before it can be properly indicted. Indicting it without understanding its internal logic produces mockery instead of analysis. Palpatine deserves the worst treatment of being shown to be coherently, deliberately and intelligently wrong. Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin developed his doctrine over years of practical governance in the Outer Rim, confronting the actual mathematics of maintaining Imperial control across millions of systems with finite military assets. In Legends continuity, the framework was formalized as Imperial Communique number 001044.92V, presented to Palpatine approximately 18 years before the Battle of Yavin. In Disney canon, the 2014 James Luceno novel Tarkin establishes the same philosophical architecture in the current continuity. Two separate continuities, same doctrine. The Death Star Technical Companion, a West End Games Legends source, records the core formulation as rule through fear instead of through idealistic government agencies. The Star Wars Death Star Legends novel confirms it as officially recognized by the Empire and named as such. This wasn't institutional attitude or informal culture. It was written policy, formally filed, officially named, governing doctrine across the entire Imperial military apparatus. The formal structure covered three principles: territorial consolidation, rapid communication, and the rule of fear. The third principle is where the doctrine's theory of victory lives, and it runs as follows. The Empire controls millions of inhabited systems. No military force, regardless of size, can permanently garrison every one of them in strength sufficient to suppress any conceivable local uprising. Active occupation is expensive, supply chain intensive, and strategically self-defeating. The visible presence of Imperial forces on every inhabited planet is a daily reminder of foreign control, and occupations produce resistance movements as reliably as any physical law. An empire trying to suppress every rebellion everywhere simultaneously through direct force application is an empire that bleeds its military capacity against a problem that regenerates faster than it can be solved. Garrison troops breed the resentment that becomes the next garrison problem. The arithmetic of direct control doesn't close. Tarkin's solution was to stop trying to be everywhere through force, and instead make the consequences of defying the Empire so total, so publicly demonstrated, and so unambiguously catastrophic that no system's leadership ever rationally concludes rebellion is worth attempting. One demonstration, one inhabited world destroyed in full view of the Holonet, the Imperial Senate, and every planetary governor simultaneously, changes every calculation in the galaxy at once. Rebellion stops being a question of whether you can win. It becomes a question of whether the attempt is worth the annihilation of your planet, your population, and everyone you're responsible for governing. This is deterrence theory, and at the level of strategic logic, it works. The Cold War's central stability depended on both superpowers maintaining arsenals so destructive that their use guaranteed mutual annihilation, and neither used them against the other, precisely because the consequences were visible, understood, and absolute. The threat was the policy. Tarkin applied this logic to interstellar governance at galactic scale, and concluded that deterrence required one specific thing conventional fleet assets structurally couldn't provide: a weapon capable of performing a definitive, visible, galaxy-wide demonstration of complete annihilation in a single engagement. That distinction, the one thing 10,000 Star Destroyers can't do that one Death Star can, is the political logic that makes the doctrine coherent on its own terms. 10,000 Star Destroyers can defeat any opposing fleet, occupy any system they enter, and project conventional power across an enormous area simultaneously. They can't demonstrate resist, and we erase you from the galaxy in a single firing that every inhabited system witnesses in the Holonet simultaneously. Star Destroyers destroy ships and garrison planets. They don't erase civilizations in a single, visible, irreversible act of demonstration. The specific deterrent function the Tarkin Doctrine required, one unambiguous, galaxy-wide proof that Imperial will can't be resisted without complete annihilation, needed a weapon that conventional fleet assets couldn't replicate. Palpatine chose the Death Star over Thrawn's fleet not out of irrationality or vanity alone, but because his theory of control logically required the one instrument Thrawn's alternative couldn't provide. The theory failed at its first test, and the manner of its failure was instructive about everything wrong with the logic at its foundation. Alderaan was the demonstration. 2 billion people. A core world selected because its prominence, the Organa family, Princess Leia's direct connection to the Imperial Senate, the planet's pacifist reputation, would make the destruction maximally visible to every power center in the galaxy simultaneously. Grand Moff Tarkin ordered it personally. The intended message was calibrated. Even senators, even old nobility, even peaceful core worlds with no military significance get erased without consequence. Comply or become asteroid fields. Within hours, the Rebel Alliance launched a full assault on the station. The doctrine assumed the relationship between demonstrated force and submission was linear. More brutal demonstration produces more compliance. That assumption doesn't survive contact with the actual psychology of populations facing atrocity at extreme scales. When a pacifist planet is destroyed, the demonstration doesn't prove that resistance is futile. It proves that compliance is also futile, that imperial loyalty provides no protection, that behavior doesn't determine survival. At that point, the cost-benefit calculation inverts for a significant portion of the galaxy at once. Fighters have nothing left to preserve. Sympathizers become combatants because surrender has been demonstrated to be no safer than fighting. Former neutrals conclude the Empire can't be negotiated with and can't be appeased, only opposed. The demonstration meant to make resistance unthinkable made it, for an enormous number of actors simultaneously, the only remaining rational option. Princess Leia told Tarkin this before the weapon fired. "The more you tighten your grip, Tarkin, the more star systems will slip through your fingers." She wasn't appealing to his conscience. She was delivering a strategic assessment of how deterrence fails when it crosses into demonstrating that compliance offers no safety. Tarkin dismissed it and fired the weapon. Then, his doctrine destroyed him, along with his station. He was aboard Death Star 1 at the Battle of Yavin. The man who argued that fear of force was more durable than force itself died when his fear weapon turned out to have a 2-meter exhaust port connected to the main reactor. The Empire's response to Yavin was to build the second Death Star. The doctrine didn't update itself between failures. Death Star 1 at the Battle of Yavin, approximately 18 years under construction. Active operational life, measured from the Alderaan demonstration to the station's destruction, was a matter of hours. One successful primary weapon firing in its entire combat history. Cause of destruction: a 2-meter thermal exhaust port connected directly to the main reactor, exploited by one proton torpedo, fired by one pilot who had flown a targeting computer equivalent of it thousands of times over his father's moisture farm on Tatooine. The port was a functional design necessity of the reactor system, which meant the most expensive construction project in galactic history had a single point of failure vulnerability that couldn't be removed without redesigning the station's fundamental engineering from its core outward. 18 years of construction, 1 day of active operation, 1 torpedo. The entire 1 trillion credit investment returned 0 strategic value beyond the Alderaan demonstration, which, as documented, produced the opposite of its intended effect. Death Star 2 at the Battle of Endor, larger, more heavily armed, and not yet fully operational when the Rebel fleet arrived. Its shield generator was mounted externally on Endor's moon, rather than integrated into the station itself, a design dependency that required the Rebel ground team to separately disable the generator before the space assault could penetrate the station's defenses. This created a 2-front vulnerability the Empire's enormous concentration of force couldn't resolve simultaneously. While Imperial forces pursued the ground team on Endor's surface, the space battle proceeded above. During the entire engagement, the Death Star 2 never successfully fired its primary weapon against the Rebel fleet. Lando Calrissian in the Millennium Falcon and Wedge Antilles in an X-Wing penetrated the interior superstructure, destroyed the main reactor, and the station destroyed itself from within. The fully crewed, partially operational second 1 trillion credit station produced 0 successful primary weapon firings in its entire existence. Total primary weapon uses across both Death Stars combined, across the entire galactic civil war. 1. At Alderaan. Against an undefended planet with no military infrastructure, no shields, and no capacity for resistance. 2 trillion credits. 1 combat application. Both stations destroyed in the same war they were each individually built to end. The Executor's destruction at Endor is the case that makes the fleet argument most immediately visceral, because the mechanism of its end is almost an argument by itself. Rebel A-Wing pilot Arvel Crinid, in a damaged and uncontrolled fighter, crashed through the Executor's bridge during the battle. The bridge crew, including Admiral Piet, an officer who had survived Darth Vader's well-documented practice of force-choking subordinates who failed him, which was a significant achievement in career longevity given Vader's standards, was killed instantly. Without bridge command, the Executor lost navigation control, fell out of formation, and impacted Death Star 2. The Star Wars Character Encyclopedia records it without ambiguity. An A-Wing destroys the Executor's bridge, killing the crew and crashing the ship. 325 billion credits, 280,000 crew, 19 kilometers of reinforced dagger-shaped hull, removed from the battle in approximately the time it takes to read this sentence. The plot armor objection is the intellectually honest version of the Imperial apologist defense, and it deserves a direct answer. Yes, Crinid's A-Wing hitting the bridge required specific circumstances. The bridge shields were down at that moment. The fighter happened to be on that vector at that instant. These weren't guaranteed conditions, and stating that the Executor should have survived any engagement is a defensible position on those specific grounds. Agreed. But that defense validates the prosecution rather than defeating it. The question isn't whether the Executor could be destroyed under any circumstances. It's whether concentrating 325 billion credits and 280,000 people in one hull, with one command bridge and no functional redundancy in that bridge's protection, represents sound strategic investment when the failure mode for that single structure is the ship and its entire crew become a 19-kilometer projectile. The Executor had one command center. Destroying it ended the engagement for 280,000 sailors in the time it took a fighter to cross a window. Whether that outcome required unfortunate circumstances or not, the result is that the most expensive warship in the Imperial fleet contributed to the Battle of Endor for roughly as long as it takes to draw a breath. Lose one Star Destroyer out of 10,000, and the fleet continues its operational mission without interruption. Lose the Executor, and the Battle of Endor changes in 3 seconds. That asymmetry between investment and fragility is the structural consequence of concentration doctrine. And at the scale and duration of a galactic war, the circumstances for failure always arrive eventually. The Eclipse-class Star Dreadnought is what the superweapon doctrine looks like when it survives Endor and continues into Legends continuity without correction. Palpatine, resurrected after his death at the Battle of Endor, commissioned a ship that mounted a super laser variant as its primary weapon. The design philosophy is almost allegorical. 2 Death Stars built, Emperor killed, Emperor returns, builds the same weapon again, but now it moves. The man committed to a theory through empirical evidence that would have persuaded anyone else to reconsider it. The official stated length, 17,500 meters, the figure in the reference books. The Executor's confirmed length reached 19,000 meters only after multiple revisions across different reference editions, with earlier sourcebooks citing considerably shorter figures before the licensing apparatus reconciled the ship's established visual scale against estimates that demonstrably undershot it. The Eclipse's 17,500-meter figure hasn't undergone equivalent revision. Visual depictions in the Dark Empire comics, the primary Legends source for the Eclipse, show the ship at roughly twice the Executor's apparent scale, which creates an obvious arithmetic problem. A ship depicted as visually larger than a 19,000-meter vessel can't simultaneously carry an official measurement shorter than that vessel without one of the 2 data points being wrong. The stated measurement and the depicted scale can't both be accurate. The 17,500-meter figure is what the record shows. The visual evidence suggests something larger, and no official source has formally resolved the discrepancy. Stated length, reportedly 17,500 meters. What isn't contested, the eclipse was destroyed in Legend's continuity. The pattern completed itself one more time. Build a superweapon, lose the superweapon. The Emperor who died at Endor because of the superweapon doctrine came back, built another iteration of the same weapon, and died again. The strategic assessment didn't update between deaths. Running the full resource accounting produces a figure that reframes the strategic failure at its largest scale. 2 Death Stars, 2 trillion credits. At 150 million credits per Imperial-class Star Destroyer, that's the construction equivalent of roughly 13,300 ISDs. The Executor, 325 billion credits, another 2,167 ISDs equivalent. Total confirmed superweapon program cost across the Galactic Civil War, approximately 2.325 trillion credits, or the construction equivalent of around 15,500 Star Destroyers. Every single one of those assets was destroyed in the same conflict. None of them prevented the war. None altered its outcome at any decisive moment in the Empire's favor. The single successful primary weapon use across the entire program, Alderaan, radicalized the rebellion rather than suppressing it, as the immediate rebel response and the Battle of Yavin demonstrated with definitive clarity. A fleet of 10,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers, the conservative number representing 1 Death Star's equivalent spending, carries 720,000 TIE fighters and 97 million ground assault troops, deployed across 10,000 systems simultaneously. Against that distribution, the rebellion faces a problem that proton torpedoes and thermal exhaust ports don't solve. There is no single reactor to destroy that ends the campaign. There is no single bridge window that changes the battle. There are 10,000 individual capital ships, each individually recoverable from loss without degrading the fleet's overall operational mission, the campaign continuing regardless of which specific hull goes down in any given engagement. Against distributed fleet mass at that scale, the rebellion has no viable staging areas and no safe recruitment systems, no space lanes where forces can move without interception, and no uninhabited systems where regrouping after a defeat is possible, because the Empire has ISDs everywhere simultaneously without requiring the Death Star's presence to establish that coverage. The fleet mass argument isn't simply more ships defeat fewer ships. It's the doctrine of simultaneous presence everywhere defeats the doctrine of one very terrifying place. And the one very terrifying place loses the campaign the day someone notices it has an exhaust port. Thrawn understood this. He argued it in operational terms, with the specific documented evidence of his TIE Defender program being cancelled to fund the station that would eventually be destroyed by the pilot whose targeting instincts were built over Tatooine's canyons. Palpatine heard him, acknowledged his rank by making him the Navy's senior commander, and built the Death Stars anyway. Both were destroyed. The Executor was destroyed in the same battle as the second one. 2.325 trillion credits of superweapon assets, all gone, the war lost regardless. Thrawn commanded from the Chimera throughout his career, an Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, 1,600 meters, the standard instrument of the doctrine he'd always argued for. He didn't need a weapon that could destroy planets. His theory of victory didn't require one. In Legends, operating about 5 years after Endor, leading a campaign against the New Republic from that single 1,600-meter hull, Thrawn came closer to reversing the outcome of the Galactic Civil War than any Imperial commander before or after him. His method was specific and documented. He studied his enemy's art to decode their psychology, then predicted their tactical decisions from cultural analysis, and used that prediction to position his forces before engagements began rather than reacting during them. He defeated his opponents through preparation and positioning rather than raw firepower. His campaigns relied on coordination, misdirection, and fleet assets that could execute complex multi-vector operations simultaneously. the distributed, adaptive approach he'd always argued was more strategically sound than concentration of force in a single enormous hull. By the available evidence in Legends, he was winning. The New Republic's military leadership was struggling to adapt to an opponent who defeated them before the shooting started. He was assassinated by his own bodyguard, Rook, before the campaign concluded. A bodyguard's betrayal, an internal failure, a human intelligence problem, the kind of institutional fracture the Empire had never addressed because it had always assumed that sufficient concentrated firepower would eventually make governance competence irrelevant. A weapon capable of destroying planets would make sound administration unnecessary. When the weapons were gone, the institutional fragility that had always existed remained, unchanged, and it killed Thrawn's campaign from the inside rather than from any rebel military success. That outcome is, in a sense, the Doctrine's final statement. Thrawn's method worked when Thrawn applied it. The method required distributed assets, sound strategic philosophy, and commanders capable of executing complex operations without the crutch of overwhelming singular force. The Empire had organized itself around the exact opposite: fear as policy, force as concentrated mass, and the conviction that raw deterrence made strategic thinking a secondary concern. The Death Stars were the fullest expression of that approach. The Doctrine was the mistake that produced them. Imperial Communique number 001044.92v, the Tarkin Doctrine, formally filed, officially named, personally endorsed by the Emperor, argued that fear of force was more strategically durable than force itself. It was tested twice in direct combat against the Rebel Alliance, at Yavin and at Endor. Both tests ended with the Empire's most expensive assets destroyed, its command structures decapitated, and the rebellion operationally stronger than before each engagement. The Doctrine worked once, for hours, against one undefended planet, and the demonstration it performed radicalized the galaxy rather than pacifying it, producing the assault on Yavin in that same engagement window. One Grand Admiral told Palpatine this was going to happen. The math wasn't complicated. Operational analysis, not prophecy. The specific, documented evidence was already there in the TIE Defender's cancelled funding, in the fleet presence thinning across key systems, in the straightforward division of 1 trillion by 150 million. Palpatine heard the argument, elevated Thrawn to the highest rank in the Imperial Navy, and built the Death Stars regardless. The first was destroyed by a moisture farmer from Tatooine. The second never successfully fired its primary weapon. The Executor was removed from the Battle of Endor by a damaged A-wing that happened to be pointed in the wrong direction at the right moment. The most terrifying weapons in galactic history produced one successful demonstration against a pacifist planet, radicalized the opposition, and were destroyed in every subsequent engagement they entered. Palpatine built them instead of 10,000 Star Destroyers, and those weapons were the reason the Empire lost. Thrawn was right. He was always doing the math that said so. The Emperor just wasn't listening. Subscribe for more stories like this.